So, good morning everyone. It's nice to see you all back here again for the fifth study in our series on God's character. We're using the book Jesus Shows the Way as our base for this series, and you can get the book from us or get it off the website, download it from the website. So we'd like to go to page 44 because we're continuing this series now. And in page 44, or Genesis chapter 4 verse 6, we read about Cain and Abel. And we want to see that in the Old Testament too, that was the book of Genesis was given to Moses, and he wrote it down, what he came to understand that the Lord showed him as a prophet. And in the book of Genesis there are many stories which teach us that it was never God's plan that men kill other men, and even your enemies too. But this was not always understood because it was so common, such a common way of dealing with disputes, or with wanting things that other people had that you wanted to have, to go to war with them. So we'll read about Cain and Abel just as an introduction. Genesis 4:6. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lies at the door. So Cain offered a sacrifice to the Lord which was not acceptable in the Lord's eyes because it didn't involve the symbolism of the shedding of blood, which was a symbolism of Christ dying for humanity. And Cain offered the fruits of the field, and Abel offered the correct sacrifice. And so Cain felt angry at his brother Abel because Abel was accepted but Cain wasn't. The Lord warned Cain of his anger and where it would lead to. And so he said in the verse 7, If you do well, shall you not be accepted? But if you do not well, sin lies at the door. So basically, God is saying, if you turn away from me and my ways, sin will break out in your character. Sin will break out in your character. And this is true today too. If we obey God, we do well and we're accepted. But if we rebel against God and His requirements and His ways, then sin lies at the door. Sin is the only alternative to God. There's no third way. There's God, sin, and all that involves in our relationship with sin, but there's no real third alternative. So let's read what happened then in verse 8. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? So obviously the Lord knew where Abel was, because the Lord knows everything. But Cain lied and said he didn't know. And this is showing once again that he added lies to murder, he added deception to murder. And so this is a serious warning that when we break God's will and God's commandments in one area, we'll end up breaking it in all areas. I'd like now to go to Genesis 6 verse 1, which is also found on this page. And once again we see that a development took place that is outlined by Moses when he wrote the book of Genesis. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So there were two lines. There was the line of Cain, there was the line of Abel. And the line of Cain went their own way. They went the way of sin. And the line of Abel went God's way. And when when Abel was murdered, then Seth took his place in the righteous line. Now this developed as the population developed, and so we had the sons of men, we had the sons of God. So some people speculate that these sons of God are angels or people from other worlds who have never fallen. But we want to see that when we become born again, we become a son of God. And so this is the context in which this is spoken about, that these were human beings who were sons of God, because the only ones who have physical reproductive power are men and women who are from this earth. The other planets don't have that, and they don't do that in heaven, reproduce in the way we do on this earth. So these sons of God were definitely from the earth. They were descendants of Seth. Now, eventually these sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair. And so they married these women, and from that the two lines basically amalgamated together and formed one group, except for a few isolated, isolated individuals and groups who remained faithful to God. Okay, so this amalgamation caused the wickedness to spread because the sons of God compromised in order to marry the daughters of men. So wickedness spread until the thoughts and intents of the heart, as it says, verse 6 of Genesis 6, found on page 45. It says that every imagination of the thoughts of the heart was only evil continually. Excuse me a minute. Okay, so evil continually. And what else does it say? The thoughts and intents were evil continually. So this always creates disharmony with God. Obviously, God can't support wickedness because God is a God of love, and his people revealed that love. But the wicked were revealing the character of their leader, who was Satan, and they were slaves, became slaves of sin. And so this is a development which always leads to war and bloodshed. And so this led eventually to a total rejection of God, which took place at the time of the flood. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the series. So we'll come back to this, but we want to realise that where there is wickedness, where thoughts and intents are evil continually, that there's always a withdrawal of God's protecting care. So when this happens, God's protecting care is withdrawn. And we'll see this when we come to study further on. So just bear that in mind. On the other hand, God's protecting care is remaining with these ones who were faithful. And from this line, we know that Noah and his family came. And the patriarchs, the kings and patriarchs came through this line, priests and kings, I should say, priests and kings. Okay, so now let's go to the time of Abraham. And in Abraham's time, we read that Lot was taken captive by the kings who lived around Sodom and Gomorrah. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were fighting with the local kings, and Lot was in Sodom, and he was taken and carried away. So we read in Genesis 14:14. We'll begin with 14:13. We'll start in verse 12. And they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. And there came one that escaped, and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the plain of Mamre, the Ammonite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Abner, and these were confederate with Abraham. Now we're on the top of page 46, Genesis 14:14. When Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan, So Abraham had 318 trained servants who comprised a small army of men. And these men, it says in verse 15, and he divided himself against them, he and his servants by night, and smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods, and also brought again his brother Lot, and his goods, and the woman also, and the people. So no doubt God had a better way of delivering Lot than the way Abraham used. But Abraham at that time had come out of heathen places in Mesopotamia, and he was unfamiliar with all of God's ways. He understood many of God's ways, but was still not really up on God's character fully at that time. So we read now Genesis 15:1. Abraham must have been troubled as he thought upon what had taken place when he returned home. Because if you slay the men and some of the leaders of another nation or tribe, what's likely to happen to you? They will come back and attack you again when they regroup. They'll remember that Abraham. They'll want to seek revenge. And so Abraham was in danger of becoming involved in tribal wars. And that was the last thing he wanted. He was a man of peace. He wanted to serve God. And so he was very concerned. And so in Genesis chapter 15 verse 1, found on page 46, we read, After these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. So we should write this one on the board. In Genesis 15 in verse 1, what did God say? He was his shield and exceeding great reward. Now, being his shield meant what? It meant that God would protect him, would put his protecting care around Abraham. So he said he would be his shield. And his exceeding great reward was that his family would become the leaders of a great nation, as God had promised, that Abraham's progeny would become as numerous as the sands of the sea. So these two things, God assured him that I will be your shield. You don't need to fight. You need to stay close to me, and I will shield you from these nations round about. And so then we see that this understanding was given to Jacob a little bit later on. Isaac perhaps was not so familiar as Jacob was, who gave a good example of it in his life. So we know the story of Jacob if we go to page 47. Most people know the story of Jacob, that he, because of his deceiving his brother over the birthright, he had to leave the family there and go and live with his relations, distant relations. And he went to live with Laban, and there he found a wife. In fact, he found more than one wife when he himself was deceived. But we're not going to talk about that so much. We want to talk about Jacob in relation to the way he conducted himself when he was being persecuted. So Jacob found that the sons of Laban were feeling jealous of him, and they started to hate him. And Laban himself, his father-in-law, his countenance changed towards Jacob as well. And the Lord told Jacob, "Go back to your home place. It's time to go back." And so let's read Genesis 31 verse 1, found on page 47. And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, "Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory." And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, "Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So God told Jacob it was time to leave. We don't know really whether it was God's plan for Jacob to steal away unawares, or whether he should have just told his father-in-law it was time for him to go. But obviously he feared that Laban would not allow him to go, or perhaps might keep his wives and his goods and throw him out. And so we read in verse 20, found on the same page, "And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all that he had, and he rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. And he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead." So it appears that Laban had an evil intent and was acting in anger towards Jacob. Let's read verse 24 now. "And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob neither good nor bad. Then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the Mount Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, What hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares from me, and carried away my daughters as captives taken with the sword? Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and did not tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and with tabret, and with harp, and hast not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast done foolishly in so doing. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt." So here is the thing that was on Laban's mind: to hurt Jacob, maybe even to slay him, and to take his family back, his daughters and the grandchildren back. But, okay, here's the big but. But the God of your father spoke unto me yesternight. So last night, God spoke to Laban, saying, Take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. So God spoke to Laban and said, just settle down. Settle down. Jacob's under my special protection. Leave him alone. Don't touch him. And that was sufficient. God interfering in the meeting to turn the tide in Jacob's favour. So can you see that God was the shield and the exceeding great reward to Jacob as well as to Abraham? Can you see that? Good. Because God was a shield. He told Laban, don't touch my anointed. Leave him alone. So that is what happened. And God protected Jacob. Now Jacob then went on to an even greater test, as we shall soon read. And we'll see that God in the Old Testament was seeking to teach this lesson of trust in him as our protector. And at the time of the flood, who was protected during the time of the flood? Noah and his family, weren't they? Who was shielding Noah and his family in the time of the flood? God. So you want to see the protecting power of God is there for those who trust in him. Now, did Noah take up a sword and try and kill all the people in the earth? No, he didn't. Did Jacob? No. Abraham didn't understand it fully, but God still protected him. Okay, so if you read at the bottom of the page what I've written in this book, bottom of page 48. Immediately after God solving this family's dispute and ruling justly in Jacob's favour, Jacob was confronted by a much more determined, deadly foe. Remarkably, this was Esau, his brother. Now the same test was repeated, yet this time the test was much tougher. That's exactly what happened. A much bigger test. Now God gave Jacob confidence in his relationship with Laban to pass the next test, which was a much more deadly test. So we read on page 49 in Genesis 32 verse 1. And Jacob went on his way, and angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, This is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. So here we have Jacob. He came from, just get some more room on the board here. This blue pen doesn't rub out very well, so I'll just do my best here in this corner. Because I like to use the board. Helps to fix it in people's minds. Okay, so Jacob came from this experience with Laban and his sons. And then he had to meet Esau. And we'll see what happened when he met Esau. But first he was strengthened by angels. So these angels met him. Now, if you met some angels, would that strengthen you? Sure, it was a big strengthening. Those mighty, powerful angels. And of course the Holy Spirit was working upon Jacob as well. But Jacob was to get even more strengthened when he met with Christ himself. Before he met with Esau, he would meet with Christ. And this would strengthen him even further. So Jacob also sent some goods, some of his wealth to Esau to say, I'm sorry for what I did. And this was in harmony with God's will. And this we should do too. If we wrong someone, because Jacob had wronged his brother, we should make reconciliation as well. Okay. So we go to page 49 in Genesis 32:3. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall you speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and asses, flocks and men servants and women servants. And I have sent to tell my Lord that I may find grace in thy sight. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, We came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, with 400 men with him. So here we have the reply of Esau. He brought 400 men with him. So what was his plan in the beginning, at least? He was suspicious, wasn't he, of his brother, and he still had a spirit of revenge, I would say, at that stage. Certainly the way it appears. Would you bring 400 men to meet your brother who you hadn't seen for a long time? Armed men? No, not normally. Especially if you had a fight with them the last time you met. Not a physical fight, but a disagreement, a major disagreement. So when Jacob got that news in verse 7, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds and the camels into 2 bands, and said, If Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which said unto me, Return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all thy mercies, and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the woman with the children. And thou said, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So Jacob claimed God's promises, and to all appearances that he was about to die along with his company, he claimed those promises in the face of great adversity. And verses 24 to 30 tell of Jacob wrestling with God, and that God was Jesus who met with him there. We go to verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and then wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, that's Jacob, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. So did the man Jacob was wrestling with know who he was wrestling with? He did, didn't he? And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hath prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. So who was he wrestling with? Jesus. He was wrestling with Jesus, because Jesus is both God and man. And at that time, Jesus was coming to Jacob in the form of a man. But he often appeared in the Old Testament in the form of an angel. Chapter 33, verse 1. So Jacob got what he was wanting to get, the blessing from God. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the 2 handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hintermost. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near to his brother. And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So was God able to control Esau and his men? The answer is a definite yes. When Jacob put his life into Christ's hands totally, in the lives of his family, his household, then Esau's heart was melted. God found something good in Esau that really responded to brotherly love. And Esau was reconciled to his brother Jacob. A very beautiful story of how God can solve very complex problems without the use of the sword. Is that true? Yes. Now, if Jacob had been a man of war, he would have had servants with him who would have had their weapons ready to fight against Esau. And there would have been much bloodshed. But God solved the problem without any doubt in a very beautiful way. If we go over the page to page 52 now, and we won't read this whole story, but basically Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, treated the local people very badly as a result of some of the local people, it seems, raping Jacob's daughter and their sister Dinah. and then one of them wanted to marry her. And Simeon and Levi retaliated very harshly to the local people. And Jacob feared that he would be destroyed by those people. So let's go to Genesis 35 verse 1. And God said unto Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make there an altar unto God that appeared unto thee when thou fleddest from the face of Esau thy brother. Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. And let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make thee an altar unto God, who answered me in the way of my distress, and was with me in the way which I went. And they gave unto Jacob all the strange gods that were in their hand, and all their earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the oak which was by Shechem. So basically, Jacob cleansed the camp of all iniquity that he knew was still there. And there was a general, what would we say, reformation of some kind among his family. Now, verse 5, And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were round about them, and they did not pursue after the sons of Jacob. The terror of God. You can say the fear of God. Fear or terror of God. Now, this doesn't mean that God was heavy-handed with those people, but all of us have a relationship with God of some kind. But if we turn away from God, then most of us have a feeling of separation. And if God begins to work on our minds, saying that he will leave us to ourselves to reap what we have sown, we feel a terror about what will come upon us. And this terror, or this fear of being totally separated from God and left in the hands of Satan and evil men, will come upon us. And so God worked upon these people in the surrounding people to prevent them from attacking Jacob. The last story we want to deal with today is found on page 53. And this is Moses, the story of Moses. Now, Moses was the one who wrote all these stories down. But Moses wrote them down after he had already killed the Egyptian and made that mistake. So it was a part of Moses' education to look back on his predecessors and to understand what they went through, when God blessed them and when God didn't bless them so much. So Moses learned from his predecessors. So Moses was an Israelite born in Egypt, and in the special providence of God became a great leader in Egypt and a commander of the armies there. Page 53. And it came to pass, Exodus 2:11, in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killed the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So Moses was trained to be the commander of the Egyptian forces. So we'll talk about Moses for a minute. Moses was called by God to be the leader of God's people. But Moses expected a military solution. Because Moses was the commander of the Egyptian forces. He knew how to fight as he grew up. And so Moses expected a military solution to leading the children of Israel out of Egypt. And therefore he slew the Egyptian, thinking that that would be the way the campaign would start. So Moses was about 40 years old when this happened. And then Moses had to go into the wilderness for 40 years to unlearn that way of doing things and to learn to trust in God, that God would lead them out of Egypt. And so this is what happened. Now, eventually, when Moses did lead them out of Egypt, we want to read how God proposed to lead them out of Egypt. We go to Exodus 23:27, found on page 54 of this booklet. We read, I will send my fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come, and I will make all thine enemies to turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. So that is how God said he would do it. Now, the way in which God destroys and men destroy are two different things. And we'll come to this as we go through these studies later on. But first I want to establish that man is to operate under the principles of God's government, and that Moses was taught not to look for a military solution. Jacob was taught the same thing. Abraham was taught the same thing. Noah was taught the same thing. And Abel was taught the same thing. And so was Seth and that royal line were taught the same thing. And when Jesus came, he taught the same thing. You have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, etc., etc. We want to read another one too. This one is from page 57, Deuteronomy 7:17. If thou shalt say in thine heart, these nations are more than I, how can I dispossess them? Thou shalt not be afraid of them, but shall well remember what the Lord thy God did unto Pharaoh and unto all Egypt, the great temptations which thine eyes saw, and the signs and wonders, and the mighty hand and the stretched out arm, whereby the Lord thy God brought thee out. So shall the Lord thy God do unto all the people of whom thou art afraid. Moreover, the Lord thy God will send a hornet among them, until they that are left and hide themselves from thee be destroyed. Thou shalt not be affrighted of them, for the Lord thy God is among you a mighty God and terrible. And so on. So God said that he would push the people out. Just like to read a quote from a book called Patriarchs and Prophets. And this is page 392, paragraph 3 by Ellen White, who was a very good Christian woman. She wrote some wonderful books. And here we read, the Lord had never commanded them to go up and fight. It was not his purpose that they should gain the land by warfare, but by strict obedience to his commands. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 392, paragraph 3. So, when the Red Sea incident happened, they crossed the Red Sea and the Egyptian army attempted to follow them into the sea. The Egyptian army was destroyed in the sea, and the weapons from that destruction were washed up on the beaches. And apparently the Israelites must have picked up that weaponry from the beaches, because in Exodus 17 verse 8, as found in verse 58, we see that the Israelites were fighting with Amalek. And where did they get the weapons from, other than from the Egyptians? There was nowhere in the desert where they could have got those weapons from. So just to wrap this up this morning about how God in the Old Testament tried to teach the people not to take up the sword, we'll read from Ezekiel chapter 20 verse 24. It's found on page 60 of this book. Because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes, and had polluted my Sabbaths, and their eyes were after their fathers' idols. Wherefore I gave them also statutes that were not good, and judgments whereby they should not live. Okay, so when God's people pick up the sword and use the sword against God's character and against God's will, then God gives them statutes that are not good and judgments whereby they should not live. And so the way of the sword was one of those things. And then Psalm 81 verse 10. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt. Open thy mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. So what does God do when we don't obey him? He gives us up to our own heart's lust. And that is in eating and drinking and that sort of thing it's referring to. But it's also walking in our own counsels. And walking in our own counsel was that they took up the sword from the Egyptians. And then they walked in that way. And because they didn't trust as Jacob did, they didn't trust as Noah did, as Abel did, then it says in verse 13, "Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. I should soon have subdued their enemies." So who would have subdued their enemies? God would have. He would have done it quickly. "And turned my hand against their adversaries." So this was God's great promise, that he would do this work. So we'll stop there. There's some other good examples in this booklet from the Old Testament which teach us how God worked when they really trusted in him. And we'll begin next week with Jehoshaphat, and then finally we'll get on to Job, who lived before the flood, and his testimony is a marvellous testimony. Okay, thank you.